Over the past 5 months, we have seen a massive shift in the narrative regarding Canada's housing crisis. For years and years, we heard from politicians and from housing experts that our crisis is just about a lack of supply and we just need to build, build, build to get our way out of this. And in the past 5 months, the narrative has changed. We're hearing politicians talk a little bit about the demand for housing and how our supercharged population growth is contributing to the surge in prices and why they need to revisit some of those policies. So today, I'm going to unpack how the experts got Canada's housing crisis so wrong. What were their recommendations? How realistic were they? And why they failed and why things are pivoting now years later after home prices and rents have surged. My name is John Passalis. My team and I help buyers and sellers throughout the Toronto area make better real estate decisions. If you're looking at buying a home and you'd like to speak with me and my agents, you can just click the link in the show notes below or send me an email at askjohn@movesmartly.com. So, I think it's important to put this discussion into context. When we think about Canada's housing crisis, we hear about the supply narratives. I mean, I think it's important to talk about that these issues, these questions have come during a period of record growth in population. Prior to 2015, Canada's population was growing by about 350,000 people per year. Just before COVID, that surged to about 600,000. Then it fell when obviously people weren't traveling, the borders were closed. By the end of 2022, we were growing by 800,000 people per year. And by the end of 23, it's just under 1.3 million people per year. So to put this, if we look at this on a chart, the blue line is Canada's population growth since the early 90s, which we can see has exploded since 2015, aside from that sort of dip during COVID, while housing completions have remained flat. Okay. And the arguments from academics, from housing experts, from politicians is for years was not that this boom in population was the issue. This isn't really the challenge. The reason prices are surging is because the red line completions are not increasing and they're being held back by government regulations and red tape and zoning. And if you remove all of those things, house price or house completions will surge and skyrocket practically overnight to flood our market with supply and drive down home prices. I mean, this has been the narrative that we've been hearing for years. Countless academic papers and from think tanks, from reports actually arguing that our crisis is really just about supply, that the demand isn't a factor. And in fact, when people, of course, were publishing these reports, what is implied in that is that it's completely irrelevant. It doesn't matter how quickly our population is growing. Supply can respond to any level of population growth. If you just remove these barriers, these supposed barriers that are really restricting what builders can do. And I don't want to get into, obviously, talk about all the specific reports. I think it'd be helpful to kind of unpack sort of the main one that was driving part of this. And this is a report from CMHC, so Canada's Mortgage Housing Corporation. And, before I talk about this, I'll say that I've kind of studied in graduate school. I have a lot of kind of respect for academic research, but sometimes, and I think this is one of those times, that there is a fundamental disconnect from how academics, PhDs in housing think the worlds can operate versus what actually happens and how the world actually works. And, I think I'll just unpack CMHC's vision and solution for Canada's crisis, and I think you'll see what I mean when I say that. So Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation came out with a big report in June 2022 and tried to analyze Canada's housing shortfall. And they realized and they argued that Canada needed to build an additional 3.5 million homes over and above what we normally build by 2030. So this is effectively, if we actually kind of do the math, it's basically tripling the number of homes we build overnight. So obviously you can't triple completions overnight. It takes time to kind of scale up sort of that growth in completions. So, I did a chart a while ago that looked at, well, what would that look like, for Ontario? Because I'm based in Toronto. What would it look like? So Ontario historically is building, I don't know, 70,000 homes per year, say, something like that. And if we looked at how many homes we needed to build over and above our regular completions, we can see in this chart that completions by 2030 would need to go from just about 70,000 per year to about 600,000 per year, assuming sort of this constant growth rate in the number of homes we're building. So we talk about Canada needing to triple completions. That, of course, assumes we start from day one and completion triple. If it's a gradual process, we actually need to build 10 times as many homes by 2030 as we're building today. Now, it should go without saying, when we look at this as our government or our housing regulators' solution for our housing crisis, I mean, this is impossible. This is ludicrous. I mean, housing completions cannot accelerate that rapidly. It's not going to happen. It's impossible. There are so many reasons why. I don't even want to get into why. But if it was that simple, other countries would have done it. We wouldn't be talking about a supply crisis. It obviously cannot happen. And yet, this was the solution put forward by CMHC. Now, it's worth mentioning that not only was CMHC actually arguing that we could achieve this rapid growth, they actually believed that this would happen in an environment where home prices are plummeting. Okay, so for some context, in their report in Ontario, the average price for a home was about $871,000. And based on their analysis, that was roughly 59% of the average household's disposable income. So based on their metrics, for housing to be affordable, house prices, the average house price should not be much more than 40% of an average household's income. So based on their models and theories, basically the building sector would keep building homes and home prices would plummet, so that by the end of 2030, the average price would have gone from $871,000 to $551,000. Yet again, I mean, it's very difficult to unpack what an unbelievably unrealistic assumption that is. Builders do not build an environment where home prices are plummeting. I mean, firstly, there are a lot of negative economic side effects that happen when home prices are plummeting, but more importantly, builders are not in the business of oversupplying the market to drive down house prices. I think, again, this is perhaps the disconnect from academic theories and the academic utopia that some academics think exists, that builders just want to build to drive down home prices for us, versus what actually happens. And in an environment where home prices are falling, builders stop building. I mean, we're seeing that today in Ontario. We're not like, home prices are actually flat and builders are canceling projects. So CMHC can't even figure out how to spur housing completions now in an environment with flat home prices, and yet they think home prices are going to keep doubling and tripling year after year when home prices are falling. So when you kind of look back, and again, you can look back at all these reports and these op-eds, everyone's talking about supply. These are the ideas that they were effectively subscribing to. This idea that you can just, in 10 years, you can build 10 times as many homes as we were building, in 2022, and that this would all happen in an environment where home prices are plummeting. And in CMHC's models, Ontario home prices would fall about 37% in 9 years, and yet builders would just keep pumping out the inventory to solve our crisis because they're just benevolent philanthropists, I suppose, rather than businesses trying to maximize returns. So an unbelievable vision. I mean, you would think people would read this and say, this is crazy, this is impossible. Perhaps we need to think about whether our booming population growth is sustainable, because this solution put forward by our housing regulator is impossible. And yet, I can't recall that many people who did. Very few did. I mean, most who did were actually not housing economists. They were immigration experts, maybe labor experts, but not really housing economists. Most housing economists saw this and kind of glued onto it and said, yes, 3.5 million homes. This is what's going to solve our crisis. Let's not worry about the demand. We need immigration. Let's just keep pumping up our population as quickly as possible. And we're just going to build our way out of this. So, the question, of course, is why did economists, PhDs, academics think this? I mean, and I don't have a concrete answer for you. I mean, certainly I will say that in academia, I actually should say in North American sort of academic housing research, there is this strong bias that high house prices are really a function of one primary factor, and that is constraints on the supply of new housing. So this is the most common argument you'll hear in sort of among North American academic housing circles, that if you just free up the supply and allow builders to build, home prices will actually not appreciate at all. They'll actually appreciate at the cost of construction or inflation. And this is the utopia that the academics believe exists, that it's really just a function of supply constraints. So this certainly, I think, colored much of the thinking why they believed that you can go from building in Ontario 70,000 homes to 600,000 homes in 10 years in an environment where prices are falling 37% over that period is mind-blowing. Again, I think I don't even understand how they published that. Like, I could never publish that, because to me, that's like publishing just such a flawed document, rooted with so many freaking problems. I don't even know how, like, if you did that as a PhD thesis, how could you defend that? Like, you can't defend these solutions. It would be impossible to defend this argument. And yet this was the foundation of our housing crisis and the solution, apparently, for our housing crisis. And this went on for years. This is what academics argued. This is what PhDs argued. This is what housing advocates, this is what the politicians told us we need to do. Just sit around and wait for things to supply the surge. Pierre Poilievre, leader of the opposition, in December released a video called Housing Hell. And it had some half-baked ideas, but his main argument was we need to increase supply. His whole solution was about build more homes, and this will solve our housing crisis. And things changed in 2024. First, with the Liberals' federal budget in April 2024, where they actually talked about, in their housing section, better managing Canada's immigration policies and population growth. And much of the growth over the past, say, 10 years has been a surge in non-permanent residents. That has been the biggest increase. Many of those are from international students. So the feds, I mean, this is quite frankly, obviously a problem that they created. It happened under their watch. It took them till April of 2024 to realize that this is an issue. So again, in their housing section of their budget, they're talking about immigration policies, which again is not very typical. And again, this is a very big shift, because for years you saw the things, you saw the press releases, the conferences, it's a supply problem. Chrystia Freeland, it's a supply problem. No one really wanted to talk about population growth, and that narrative changed. And since then, they put in caps on international students. They reduced the number of international students being admitted to Canada 35 to 40% over last year. And what happened? I mean, immediately we're seeing press releases or news releases from the Globe and Mail talking about Canadian universities are facing a surprising rental market downturn. A rental market downturn is a positive thing for people who want to rent. It's not a good thing for people who have investment properties. But we suddenly have a lot more inventory. We suddenly have investors who used to buy up homes and convert them into illegal rooming houses, charging $4,000 or $5,000 a month between all the students, having a hard time doing that, and they need to rent it now to a family for $2,700 a month, because there just aren't as many students looking for those types of properties. So Again, this is a massive change. There's an academic report I saw from a bunch of academics who argued the solution to our rental crisis is just to build, wait 15 years for supply to catch up. And it didn't really matter. There are no assumptions about the demand for housing, rental housing, no assumptions about the surge in students. Effectively, they can go to whatever level and we can just build our way out of this. That obviously was a flawed argument. We can't build our way out of it that quickly, but obviously when you take the pressure off of the population growth and this record surge in demand, you're going to ease up the appreciation in rents and make renting a little bit more affordable for many people in many of those university towns. Now, more recently, in September of this month, Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservatives, has been quite clear that he as well is shifting policies, despite for the longest time arguing that our housing crisis is about red tape and supply constraints and gatekeepers and all of these things. He had a press conference recently where he talked about how his government is going to sync up supply and demand. Maybe let's just take a quick look at that clip to see kind of what he mentioned he's going to be doing.
We will cap population growth so that the housing stock always grows faster than the population. We'll have exact numbers in the next election, but we're building like 240,000 homes. That's like 1.4% increase in our housing supply. You can't grow the population faster than that unless you're going to have worse housing shortages. So we've been, under Trudeau and the NDP, we've been growing the population by almost 3%, but we grow the housing stock by 1.3, 1.4%. No wonder we're running out of homes. That's not even a question of whether you support or not immigration. It's a question of whether you support mathematics. And humans need homes, and I don't care where they come from. It doesn't matter if you've been here for 2 days or your family's been here for 2 centuries. You need a place to live. The only way to get rid of the shortage is to build homes faster than we add people, and that's why we will have a mathematical formula that caps population growth below the growth in the housing stock.
So Pierre's announcement, of course, is very much in line with what the Liberals said they were going to do in April, and apparently what they're starting to do. So now we have kind of the Liberals, of course, and the Conservatives changing the narrative about our housing crisis. For years, it was only a supply problem. Now, quite clearly, they both believe that our surge in population boom has been a very big contributor to it. So, when I see this, of course, one question that kind of jumps up to my mind is why on earth did it take politicians so long to appreciate what should have been an obvious conclusion for them to come to years ago? Like, they should have realized years ago that you can't have your population growing unchecked and assume supply will catch up. And it's impossible to say why the politicians kind of took this approach. I mean, on the one hand, you can say, well, the government, the CMHC told them that this is possible. We can kind of keep population going unchecked and just build our way out of this. The academics told them that you can do that you don't need to worry about how quickly your population's growing. You just build our way out of this. So it's very possible they just listened to the experts who were, I think quite clearly now, offering misguided and flawed advice that could never really actually materialize and obviously make our housing crisis work is kind of one potential outcome. The other is that just politicians for years just didn't want to bring that up for political reasons. They were worried about their own reputations. For years, if you question the rate of growth in Canada's population boom, some people were spinning that as being an anti-immigration position. If you raised any questions about the level, it was seen as xenophobic or racist or whatever it is. So, until now, and I think this is the important thing, it's, until consumer sentiment has shifted, and it has shifted in Canada, where Canada's population is not against immigration. They're just raising questions about what level is sustainable. And if it is too rapid, does that have negative side effects on things like housing and healthcare and so many other things? And we have our politicians today pivoting their tone after the damage has been done and after consumer sentiment has shifted. And to me, I think this is the biggest problem. If that is actually what motivated them, it is the biggest issue, because what it basically means is we're not being led by leaders. Leaders have a vision. They say controversial things when they see issues, and they try to solve problems early. When politicians wait for the damage to be so terrible, and rents to surge and prices to surge so much, where the consumers need to come up with a conclusion and realize what the issue is and make it safe for the politicians to kind of come out and shift their policy and focus not just on supply, but supply and the demand for housing. I mean, it tells you our leaders are really just followers. I mean, they're following what is the popular opinion at the time. And I think, to me, this is probably one of the most troubling things when we think about housing policy in Canada, and why it's hard to imagine it getting better, because our politicians aren't leaders. They're just reacting to the sentiments of the time. And I think that's challenging. I think that's going to be obviously one of the reasons I think it's hard to imagine how things will get much better in the future, when you don't have leaders leading, when you have them reacting years after the damage has been done. So those are a few thoughts on kind of the shift in sentiment in housing policy in Canada, some thoughts on how the experts got everything so wrong, quite frankly. And I think, again, this contributes to why so many young people kind of have a distrust of experts. You know, when we look at how terribly they screwed up this crisis, and poorly like interpretation of the problem and the solutions. I mean, how can the average person trust the housing expert who is telling them to just sit around and wait 30 years for the supply to catch up? I mean, it's hard to. So those are a few thoughts. I'd love to hear your comments. Please post them in the comments below, or shoot me an email at askjohn@movesmartly.com.